Hello, everyone. This session is going to be focused exclusively in the 19th century. If a quick recap, if we remember last session, we decided that mainly it was the choral world that had a real and sustained progress throughout the 1700s. So now that we arrived to this 19th century, the 1800s, we're going to see the birth of major ensembles, major composers, and all those activities closely associated with the growth of the particular economics of the country and how much composers by the end of the century were able to dedicate truly their life and their creativity to making music. So without much ado, welcome to this session. I am sure that we're going to have a fantastic time, and then we're going to also discover many of the compositions that perhaps other way it will be quite hard to come by. This is a journey trying to understand what is happening to the country, the United States, in the 19th century compared with other centuries. So I am going to make a lot of references to what was happening specifically in Europe in terms of the evolution of music and how each decade, each generation has their own issues, their own challenges that they try to overcome. It specifically in the United States, it is a different set of challenges, and it will take the entire century in order to, let's say, catch up in the development, not only of orchestras, but also the techniques that the composers use until when we arrive in our next session to the 20th century, we will discover how much the country is also going to lead charging forward in the development of orchestras and the symphonic world. There, the session today, I want to distribute it, organize it in 4 different statements. The first one is the actual composers that we left off. This was the cliffhanger of our past session. Anthony Philipp Heinrich, the first American composer, obviously German-American composer, that was able to dedicate their fully professional musician. So our entire life dedicated to music. We are going to talk about the second New England school, and that is making reference to the composers that live in Boston and the second half of the 1800s that help and laid the basis for all the American composers to create truly a national sound in the centuries afterwards. We are going to talk briefly about all the ensembles that were born at the end of the century, the 19th century, specifically the New York Philharmonic, as it was not only the dean, the oldest of the ensembles by a long shot, but also one of the groups that has dedicated the most in order to bring new music in centuries afterwards. And then we're going to close with our new cliffhanger for next session. What is Antonín Dvořák, and what is the importance of a Bohemian from the Czech Republic composer in the United States at the end of the 19th century? So this is our class. This is the let's say horizon that we have for today. Let's start one by one. Let's a little reflection of what was happening in the prior centuries. We talked ever so briefly the composer John Playford, and he lived in the 1600s, but he is for 2 centuries the most important instrumental composers of the time. We listened to several pieces. The particular one that I need to contrast the sound, it is our Wheels of the World. And then the whole idea is that we listen to this piece so that our palate, let's say, combining the senses, our ears are clean, so the next centuries sound as shocking as they are supposed to. Well, we discussed last session, ensembles were not created as a regular meaning, so they were not established as instrumental ensembles. It was more about the amateur and dilettante desire to make music that characterizes this time. What I want to say is it required several centuries in order to be a stable group that will perform the music the composers were creating. And then, so because there was not a highly proficient ensemble or group that could make the music, and composers were not yet professionalized in the sense that they were not fully dedicated to just composing, then the distribution of talent, the evolution of these groups, it took much longer than it had taken in its counterpart in Europe. But this is why so shocking and so relevant, so exciting to share the first composer that we are going to listen to is music by Anthony Philipp Heinrich. Um, Obviously, I am trying to pronounce the original German, but it will be pronounced in a different way, um, evidently by his contemporaries. Um, as you already noticed, he was born in the 1700s, but most of his experience as a composer was in the after and the following century. We consider him, as we discussed this, the first full-time American composer. He chaired the founding meeting of the New York Philharmonic Society 1842, and we will come back to this event at the end of our session today. In 1817, he was the first of conducting a Beethoven symphony in the United States. And then I said this with a little disclaimer. It might be the first, might be the second, but when he conducted this performance, he was not in the big metropolis. He was actually in Kentucky. And then we will see with the pieces that we're going to hear that his creativity goes beyond what everyone else was doing at the same time in Europe or in the United States. Let's listen to a couple of pieces. In 1820, he decided to compose this capriccio for orchestra. And the title is already evocative of a different mindset. The title is The War of the Elements and the Thundering of the Niagara. At the same time, in 1820, Beethoven had not yet finished his Ninth Symphony. And then every single symphonic piece that was composed in Europe at the beginning of the 1800s will follow the pattern that was given by the German tradition started by Haydn and Mozart, and even Beethoven himself. Mainly that a symphony will have 4 movements, and when you have a single movement piece, it will be an overture. There is no, or I haven't been able to find any other of these capriccios in any of the literature in Europe at the time. So that's what I find it so fascinating, so interesting. The idea of a tone poem was invented much, much later by Franz Liszt, following the ideas of Hector Berlioz. But this is a completely different generation. In 1820, in the middle of his rural home in Kentucky, this composer was making such big strides into understanding the music of the future. Now, the sound that we're going to hear perhaps is not so mature as if he had been surrounded by other colleagues of the same caliber. Let's listen to a couple of minutes of this capriccio. Very good. We are going to, or I am going to suggest for everyone here in the Canvas classroom, virtual classroom playlist, so everyone can go and listen to the entire piece to your heart content if you so desire. So for now, we need to continue because there's plenty of music that we're going to listen to today. Another example of this composer and his creativity is the Treaty of William Penn with the Indians. It's let's say a tone poem, a composition of 1834. Another of the examples that I want to listen to tonight or today will be the 1842, and the title, this is the original title, the Wildwood Spirits Chants or Scintillations of Yankee Doodle, a grand national heroic fantasia for a powerful orchestra in 44 parts. He is already imagining the ensembles that are going to be the future of the orchestra in the 20th century. For the time right now, we're going to listen to a big chunk of this piece. I challenge anyone to try to find a Yankee Doodle quote, even though it is not necessary to in order to enjoy or understand the piece. This is one of the points that we touch with the patriotic approach to making music. 1842 was the year of the annexation of Texas, the war with Mexico. So this is a moment where the nation needed a reminder of the possibilities, the heroic possibilities of the country and the political statements that were trying to be made at the time. So the piece draws from there and from the enjoyment of nature, or evident enjoyment of nature of the composer. Very well. One of the characteristics that defines the music of Anthony Philip Heinrich is his desire not to do development. Unlike the ideas that Beethoven was evolving and Schumann at the particular time that Heinrich is composing, it is to take themes and develop them. So the choice of what the music sounds at the beginning is dramatically important because depending on which melodies you hear at the start of a piece, then the composer has an opportunity of a chance to develop on them, to try to explore each of the possibilities of such a melody. In the case of Heinrich, his idea goes with more episodic, an episodic way to approach music, which means that he is not going to develop specific themes, but he's going to favor, for instance, a set of variations where there's a theme and it happens again and it starts picking apart possibilities to replay that theme. So that is completely different of a development. And for instance, in the example that we just heard, he switches direction and just changes the music without any warning for the listener. That is a particular characteristic that is gonna later on in the 20th century going to be taken by certain composers. So this piece, I can trace it directly. The next large piece that will follow all these ideas will be, for instance, Appalachian Spring by Aaron Copland. So when we hear him and his music, we're going to come back to this particular point. So I'm not saying that they sound remotely similar, but the approach to make music that is fragmentalized and compartmentalized, it is what makes them similar in that regard. The last piece that we heard, our last session, will be the last piece we're going to hear by the same composer today, 1845, Manitou Mysteries. And then last time we listened to the very beginning, I want to get a little section that perhaps exemplifies much and more eloquently the same idea. His conception of music, the passing of music, the flow of music, is not to develop the ideas that he had before, but to change in fragments the musical discourse. Very well. It's a long piece. It's about 20 minutes long in length. So I don't want to over abuse of your patience. What is important to start realizing at this point is two ideas, perhaps. Is the first one, in order to create the richness of musical life that every nation deserves, or if we want to go local, every city deserves, first there must be sufficient music in order to be performed. So by this time, the United States, this is one of the few composers, not only that lives in America, but he was considered American, added all this influence that was coming continuously from the immigrants in Europe. But it took a full century in order to start making enough music that we can say that it is now an American sound. And yet, all the approach to these composers that we're going to hear tonight follows the same idea of Heinrich, which is let's say it's trapped in early Beethoven experimental works with incredible creativity for the titles, but not yet making the music sound specifically any question of identity. The efforts that will try to look for what sounds American will start showing up in the 20th century. At this point, composers are trying to multiply and replicate all the successful efforts that are happening in Europe. And with the composers of the group that we're going to hear just in a moment, you are going to be, this is going to be more evident. But at this point, you already noticed the composers are not trying to change the way music sounds or trying to give location attached to the music that sounds. They are trying to make successful pieces. But when a composer is able to do one or two symphonic works throughout their entire lives, evidently it's quite hard to create enough of a canon in order to start exploring what does it mean that it sounds American. That's why Heinrich is so transcendental and important. The second idea is that none or virtually none of the composers that we're going to hear today takes upon all the ideas that we built in our previous session. What I mean is they do not try to explore the African American sounds. They do not try to explore these new instruments like the banjo that was incorporated in the psyche of the country. They very rarely take this patriotic fervor and transform it into a symphony. There is very few or none examples in America of someone who is capable of creating this sense of unity like Beethoven did with his Ninth Symphony. And that's such lack and absence of unity in the ideas, the political ideas and the artistic ideas, is perhaps what hindered the evolution of the symphonic music in America. For instance, none of these composers is going to take the tradition of the hymns and transform it in a direct, evident, unifying way into the music that they composed for the orchestra. So it takes Charles Ives already in the 20th century in order to take these ideas and try to start answering the question, well, who's that we are supposed to be sounding like? These composers are trying to replicate and continue the evolution, so artistically they still feel very European. Not as a criticism, it's just the moment that they live through. Very well. I need to make a little parenthesis so that we understand what is going to start happening, because it requires quite a lot of time, because there are several composers all over the world exploring what does it mean to be nationalist in terms of artistic ideas. There are several nationalism that are actually inspired by the process of independence and revolution in the United States, later on in Europe. But artistically, there are other countries that are actually leading this charge, and then the United States takes a little bit longer in order to start answering those questions. But basically, every nationalist music, at least, will require the several 5 steps that I'm going to describe. The first one is a recognition of the accomplishment of the German or by the German composers. And then that starts with evidently Beethoven, but it needs to start understanding what Schumann, Schubert, Liszt, and the German tradition, evidently in other countries like Hector Berlioz, are going to start infusing the music. And how is that they get the inspiration, and how is that they make it work? And then it requires a serious dedication to truly understand those methods. That requires a lot of effort in order to study how is that they do it, not just replicate ideas, but trying to understand truly what it means to be inspired in something and create what they were doing. There is a third step, and it's identifying those sources of identity that will serve as inspiration for the creation of a nationalist movement in music. A fourth step is when you are achieve critical mass, and it's a group of committed representatives. And that group, it doesn't have a specific number, but it traditionally is 5 or 6. So when the Russian nation was ready to create a nationalist movement, there shows up Tchaikovsky and the group of 5. And then we discussed in a previous class, the Glasgow School, the Kushka, the Mighty 5, those 5 composers with Korsakov at the head, Mussorgsky, Borodin, Kui, Balakirev, that created what we understand now is nationalist Russian music, but they created by doing all these steps. And every composer that that wants to create this nationalism in the 1800s follow the same pattern. The same happened in Spain. The same happened in Poland. It is the same steps that happen over there. And then the last step is when afterwards we can consider that they did create a nationalism. So it requires further generation recognizing what these people is doing. Um, in this regard, the composers that we're going to hear in the next group of our next section of the class are not yet nationalists. They are not trying to create a sound that distinguishes America from any other place of the world. Yes, the titles are a little more closer to uh, the regular experience in the United States, but the music still tries to follow certain patterns that are coming from Europe. So in terms of composition and evolution of the artist, they are still depending on what are the great composers of the age inventing and transforming in Europe. So Wagner is still one point of reference, and Brahms is still a point of reference, Bruckner, and even this desire to bring Mahler at the end of the century, and the desire to bring Anthony Dvorak responds to this feeling that the country still has to evolve and grow as artistic power or powerhouse. All of this big parenthesis in order to discuss one of the most fascinating group of people that I have come across in this country. And we call it the second, or we as musicologists call it the second New England school. When we discussed in last session the first New England school, it was these composers in the 1700s around Boston, around Massachusetts specifically, but in general, the whole of New England, that were making music for their religious congregations. And so it were making hymns, they were making chorales, they make the fuguing song that we discussed briefly last session. These are composers of a new generation, and it takes about 100 years afterwards. So it takes more or less the same time that it took the first and the second Viennese schools in order to develop in the counterpart in Europe. Here in the States, this second New England school are the composers of the second half of the century that start giving enough material, enough critical mass that we can start now considering, oh, perhaps this country can have something to say that belongs exclusively here. So these are the group of classical composers, also known as the Boston Six. And it's too bad that they were not considered five, because then we could make a parallel with the Celtics. But that's a different story and perhaps a little bit of a bad joke. But regularly I consider the Boston Six. So when we discuss the Mighty Five, we're discussing those five composers in Russia that I mentioned earlier that decided or help carrying off nationalist movement in Russia. These Boston Six are the first composers that are strong enough, that are born in the United States, that whether or not have education in Europe, and we will see each of them individually, but they carry on this new idea that the country can produce enough great art in order to stand on its own. They all were based in and around Boston, Massachusetts, even though one of them was born in New York, but lived in Boston and actually established strong correspondence and friendships among themselves so that we consider them together. They are the ones that are going to help establish an American classical idiom. And some of the pieces are still considered points of reference for inspiration of the nationalist composers, of composers that try to achieve this particular sense of identity, that is the symphonic sound that belongs to the country. It stands apart from its European ancestors once it takes into the 20th century, but you will see certain ideas that are actually remarkable that start being evident. So we do not need to wait until the 20th century to start seeing these examples of music that belongs here. Okay, so here are the composers. I'm just going to list them so you are familiar with the names. John Knowles Paine, Arthur Foote, George Chadwick, and his name is going to show up several times during the 20th century. And it's not order of preference or at all, not even chronological. It is simply the way I decided to organize. Amy Beach, which is one of the most important female composers in history, and has several parallels with the life of Fanny Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn's sister, although Amy Beach belonged to a different class on her own. Edward McDowell, great virtuoso of the piano. He was also a virtuoso composer, had the chance to study with the best of the la creme de la creme in Europe, and we will get to him in a moment. And one of my favorite names in the whole of evolution of music in the United States, Horatio Parker. And it is one of my favorites because he was also the teacher of one of the great names of the 20th century, but because of his approach and how attempting to make this sense of identity through symphonic music. So here are the six, the Boston Six. Let's call it the Celtics of classical music. I've been just watching a lot of sports, I guess. Okay, let's start. Let's start in order. Here's a picture of our composer, John Oldspain. Um, Obviously, sporting the facial makeup of the time, so particularly. Very well. Again, I will play the whole playlist and share with you in our Canvas class, so you will be able to hear the entire piece, and even I will suggest many more for everyone's enjoyment. Here's one more time the date. He is the first American-born composer to achieve fame for orchestral music. And then when I talk fame, it's a very localized fame, and it takes another 70 years after his death in order to be start recognized and for his music to be recorded, like the one that we just heard. He, like many composers at the end of the 19th century, they realized that they needed to move to Europe in order to study. So Payne just briefly moves to Berlin, returns to Boston in 1861. Quite a momentous time to return to the country. The Civil War started right at that year, and yet he is one of the composers that kept doing music throughout all this tragedy. He started a series of free courses, music appreciation and music theory. There was not yet an academy or a school, a conservatory that will teach music. So he started offer these courses in Harvard, and such core curriculum became the base of what later on was the music department at such prestigious university. So it was dilettante. It was a amateur, let's say, effort, voluntary, and then it became later on the music school. So in that regard, he's America's first music professor, at least understanding professor as a part of a university program. He is also the first conductor of the Boston Symphony in its maiden year. And by maiden year, I refer to the first season that the orchestra ever existed, 1881. We'll come back to all the dates of the orchestras later on, but this is the first mention of an established ensemble, and John Old Spain actually participating of this music is quite telling of his stature and how much he was appreciated by his contemporaries. Unfortunately, the 20th century was, at least at the beginning, a little unkind with the composer. But he's a prolific composer, and for that, I'm quite glad. He has one opera, Azara, and then a bunch of orchestral pieces. So it has two symphonies. The second one we're going to hear in just one moment. But if you follow the titles, you immediately infer that the place of reference were the classicals or the classics, and encompassing all of them, either Latin works, Greek works, or even Shakespeare. That is where he is finding this inspiration. The piece that we heard right at the beginning is his prelude from Oedipus Tyrannus, and it is incidental music to the actual an actual play. And then using all the Greek writings. It is quite telling again that he's using all the models of the Europeans, and he's also making an attempt to shine brightly as an independent voice. From this second symphony, in spring, we're going to hear the beginning of the fourth movement. Very good. If we decided that Heinrich was an experimental Beethoven trapped now in the rural Kentucky, then we need to consider paying more Brahmsian. And he was actually a follower and admirer of the German composer. Let's move on, not because in any way I'm not enjoying their music, but because we need to cover quite a lot. Arthur Futh, he was a long-living composer. Very good. When I say it's a long living composer, it's a composer that actually was able to enjoy most of his life in both centuries, long into the 20th century. He was a composer specifically characterized for his chamber music, although he has the piece for strings that we just heard, and he was an organist. This is a characteristic that unites many of the composers of these Boston Six. He was the organist in Boston for 32 years. He was one of the founding members of the American Guild of Organists. He was a Harvard graduate and immediately connects with the composers that were um, that we are talking. He is the first noted American composer to be trained in the United States in the school that was um, funded and created by our previous composer. Now, this doesn't have to do anything with music, but I just found it quite interesting. He lived in Dedham, in Massachusetts, and he was a member of the society in Dedham for apprehending horse thieves. So he was quite involved in the community. But as I was saying, his main output is in chamber music. And as such, he has quite a lengthy catalog of pieces for duets, trios. The piano quintet is one of the pieces that everyone has to hear at least once. The piano quartet is also quite remarkable. But the orchestral piece that made him famous and made him recognized is this suite in E major for strings, opus 63. We heard the beginning just a few seconds ago. It was premiered by the Boston Symphony, and we're going to hear now the last movement. That is in a three movements. This suite, and the last one is a fugue. Very good. Quite a remarkable piece, not only because it encompasses all the achievements of this subgenre, the suite for strings, but because it could be easily at the same level of the great examples, Tchaikovsky and Dvorak in 1900s. Let's go with perhaps one of the most fascinating composers of this group, George Chadwick. The W stands for evidently his middle name, but everyone will recognize him as George Chadwick. He was born in 1854, died as you can see over there in 1931. He was a composer that had a chance early on to go and study in Europe, specifically in Leipzig first, the Royal Conservatory of Music, and then in Munich at the Hochschule für Musik. In the late 1900s, Munich was, after Paris, the center of cultural development of Europe. So the fact that he is in Munich is quite telling. He lived in several years in Europe on his own. He belonged to a wealthy family, so he was able to stay there as long as he wanted to. And they belonged to the realist movement in the arts. The Italians call it verismo, and is to remain truth, down to earth depiction of people's lives. And it starts going away to this inspiration of the classics, the Roman, or Latin, the Greeks, the old English, particularly Shakespeare, and it goes into a little more contemporary. Basically, what Walt Whitman was doing with literature here in the United States. In 1880, Chadwick returns to Boston. We can define his music in, let's say, three important periods: the formative period up until 1894, the Americanism or modernist period all the way to 1909, and the dramatic period all the way to the end of the First World War. After this, the World War, he goes into a virtual retirement in the sense that his music doesn't hold anymore the importance or the feverish activity that has had up to this moment. Very good. I hope you start already identifying a sense of maturity in the music. So with each composer, they start influencing each other, and it starts growing in terms of the capacity, the prowess that their writing will have in the effects of the development of every ensemble that they work. In terms of operas, he was quite a prolific composer. I found already four, and it is possible that many other pieces may be found later on. Interesting, the Padrone. It is quite a compilation of immigration of immigrants in the area of Boston at the end of the 1900s. It has a piece that is sung in Spanish, one that is sung in Irish, one that is sung in Italian. Most of the piece it's in English, but it refers to these immigrants and the conflicts they are having, trying to adapt to a new life in Boston. You immediately notice that he was more concerned with the lives of his contemporaries and the real down-to-earth life, as we said earlier. In terms of orchestral music, it is, as I said, quite prolific. I did not list all the pieces that he has because there's over 100, but these, in my opinion, are the most important. And in a second, we're going to hear an excerpt from his Symphony Number 3 that is composed the year after Dvorak has From the New World Symphony. We will get to that one also in a moment. The Little Lily Nymph is perhaps his most famous piece for chorus and orchestra. So now let's listen to this Symphony Number 3. So if out of this whole session you go and listen to his Symphony Number 3, I will be a very happy man. One day we'll be able to bring all his music to the high place of honor that I think it deserves for his creativity, but also for the importance in order to form and create this sense of national idea belonging to this side of the globe in the case of symphonic music. The piece that I forgot to mention this, the piece that we heard in the previous slide was this tone poem, Tam O'Shanter. And it is one of the great examples on how to narrate or narrative way of composing on the same vein of Till Eulenspiegel by Richard Strauss. So I will dare to put them, if not in the same high level of composition, at least in the same approach and with the same intentions. Let's move on to Amy Beach. And out of the whole group, she's one of my favorites because of the conditions that she had to endure, but also for the quality of her music. Amy Beach, let's listen to a little bit. It's fascinating what she is was able to do. Also, quite prolific and long life that she was granted. She made her concert debut at age 16, and this is already 1883. His Mass in A flat major was performed in 1892 by the Handel and Haydn Society Orchestra in Boston. This is a society that every year will program a concert at the end of the season and then one at the end of the spring. And they have been doing it almost uninterruptedly since 1812. Quite an important group, and then so I decided to mention here because of them there was an opportunity at least to listen to music, even though if it was just once a year. In 1896 she performed or premiered the Gallic Symphony, and it was the very first symphony composed and published by an American woman. And that is already remarkable. One of the main characteristics of her life is that later on she was asked to come back and then serve as part of the efforts to create new musicians. And then so she served as president of the board of counselors in the New England Conservatory of Music. But she had to learn how to compose on her own. Even though she had piano teachers, she married when she was 18, and her husband, a wealthy banker, decided that she was not to live the life that she wanted, but the one that he chose for her. Quite unfortunate because it robbed us of quite a big deal of talent, but perhaps fortunate because she then had to teach herself, and boy, she did a great job. So he didn't want her to teach piano because they considered that a low paying job. And then so she showed her wealth by not having to work. But also she was only allowed to do one concert per semester in a public appearance. She did not she was not able to have a tutor because her husband considered that inappropriate. She lived many more decades after her husband, who was 25 years older than her. But at the end of her life, she was again considered not only a virtuoso pianist, a quite strong pianist, just like Fanny Mendelssohn, I was saying at the beginning, but also a composer of worth. And we, as many times as possible, celebrate her achievements. She has the opera Cabildo, and then orchestral pieces. Even though, remember, it's impossible to consider all of these achievements when you remember that she was self-taught. Her piano concerto made the rounds once she was able to tour Europe after her husband passed on her own, and it was always met with outstanding success. And her mass, complete mass in E flat major, is also one of the great achievements. Let's listen. The piece that we were hearing at the beginning of this section was his Gaelic Symphony. Let's listen to the last movement. I include the date of composition, 1896, only 4 years after Dvorak. One again, we come back to that name, even though he's not, let's say, American. But that 1892 is the date when he composed his Ninth Symphony from the New World. And then you will see that this decade will be obsessed in trying to bring those elements into the foreground of each of the composers of the Boston Six. In this case, it is, I hope, sufficiently evident to those points of relationship between Dvorak's last symphony and Amy Beach's only symphony. Very good. We need to continue, not because I don't enjoy her music. I will indulge days at a time listening to it, but because we need to cover two more of the Boston Six. Edward MacDowell. It is normally recognized as a virtuoso pianist, and most of his career was evidently developed around the instrument, but he was also a composer of worth for orchestra. The date of his life encompasses, and then you will immediately notice, barely 48 years. So he's one of the composers that had the shortest of life, unfortunately, ended quite short in circumstances that are not so favorable. He was born in New York, but then close to my own heart, he received his first piano lessons from a Colombian pianist, Juan Vitrago, a Cuban, Pablo Desverini, and the great Venezuelan pianist, the virtuoso of the time, Teresa Carreño. I write Cuba, it's my mistake, she's from Venezuela. This group of teachers actually make him one of the greatest pianists at the time, so much so that in 1877 he decided to move to Europe, and then was admitted at the Paris Conservatory, but soon enough, after only 2 years, he realized that he needed better instruction. Fortunately for him, he had a financial support of his family, so he continued his education at the Dr. Hoch's Conservatory in Frankfurt. That conservatory is quite remarkable because it has a strong connection with both Clara Schumann, after Robert passed, and Franz Liszt. In effect, Edward MacDowell was able to study with both and became a close friend with Franz Liszt, and even most of his music is published by the same publishers that Franz Liszt made his music available. So he's already in great company. But while he was in Frankfurt, he was able to study composition with Joachim Raff. That is a name that perhaps doesn't ring many bells for nowadays audiences, but at the time it was considered the true successor of Brahms. So it was as important for Edward MacDowell to study with him as if he was studying with the great composer from Hamburg. He settled back in Boston 1888, and 8 years later, he was offered a position in the Columbia University Conservatory of Music, or the music school. Unfortunately, there was some tensions with the president of the university. He was forced to resign in disgrace, and then that summed up the depression that he fell in with an accident with a cart that ran over him, evidently pushed his death, untimely death. In the terms of the music that he composed, most of his music is dedicated to the piano. So there's more than 50 works that even today are performed regularly. But for orchestra, his output is not small. You have not only two piano concertos, the second of them are still considered a masterpiece and still is played nowadays. But we're going to hear from his second suite, and he decided to call it Indian. But once again, look at the dates. It's right in that decade when composers were shown that through symphonic music, they could create an idea of nationalism, of idea of belonging through the effort of a foreign composer. Now, you will be able to judge by yourself if he was successful or not making this an Indian suite. But I have to give him the credit because he started actually attempting to make it sound, even though not because you use a pentatonic scale, you're automatically sounding Indian. And that is a conversation for a different class. What I want to say is that even though, in my opinion, he is not at all trying to research and found what is that it makes their culture unique, and then trying to represent that as a sense of unity, he at least is attempting to bring in a name so that he can start making music that sounds American, specifically American. Very good. Definitely, anytime that you get to listen to his second piano concerto, give yourselves that treat. I promise it will pay off. Now we come to the last one of our Boston Six, of the group of composers that we associate with the Boston Six, Horatio Parker. it. Yeah, I promise that his music is going to be worth listening to the whole thing. Right now, we need to continue so we can cover the entire material. His life is slightly longer than McDowell, but it follows more or less the same pattern, same dates, at least at the beginning. He studied in Boston, and then he is one of the composers that was educated first um, in the in the country, and then you will already recognize one of the names, George Whitefield Chadwick, and that is the composer we discuss, also part of the Boston Six, even though Horatio Parker was a student. He was a point of reference to Chadwick. He finished his formal education in Europe, and he went all the way to Munich. Remember, Munich was the point of reference musically, artistically in Europe at the time. When he returned, he established in 1885, established a brilliant career as an organist, first in New York, later in Boston. In 1893, he became professor of theory of music at Yale University. And it is telling the date that he was actually named in there, because that's when he met Charles Ives. And the influence and the impact that Horatio Parker is going to have on Ives, it's uncontestable. One of the characteristics of Parker is that he is starting to negotiate this conversation of what does it make music American itself. I am not, again, sure how much he succeeded, but we have plenty of interest in the music that he created, and I find as much beauty and worth as in any other composer I've ever heard. Two operas, Mona and Fairyland. In terms of orchestral output, you will see a very strong slant into the tradition first, and then he started going away from it. When he gets to Fairyland in the opera, now he's trying to think more of America than in Europe. You will see at the beginning of his life, most of the names, it remembers a resemblance of that past. Let's listen to a little bit of his music, because I promise you will start seeing all the snippets that we need into the future. I apologize. Evidently, I had also included these pieces for orchestra and chorus, and that they're also important. But we're going to hear the prelude to Mona. Later on in our following sessions, when we analyze the music of Charles Ives, we will see how much of a shock Ives is compared with the music that Horatio Parker is creating at this point. Let's move from cities, from this group of 6 composers in Boston, briefly to New York, and specifically to that Philharmonic Society of New York, nowadays called the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. The Philharmonic Society was founded in 1842 by the American conductor Ureli Corelli Hill, evidently trying to make an attempt of musicality, but it is one of those names that stuck with a person, and then he became an accomplished musician. With the aid of an Irish composer, William Vincent Wallace. I think it's quite telling that we do not know about this composer, but his music was not as relevant as many of the composers that we have discussed today. I did include a little picture. This was one of the best versions of that picture of Mr. Corelli Hill. But we cannot forget the part of the board was the composer Heinrich that we discussed at the beginning of this session. The first concert of the society took place December 7, 1842. And it opened, or the main piece was Beethoven Symphony Number 5. There were two more conductors besides Corelli Hill, and it was a program that lasted 3 hours. The orchestra itself, or as a society, was not a regularly performing ensemble. That first season, they played 2 programs. And then on, they will play between 3 and 5 programs, depending on how much they could raise in terms of funds. And the funding for the orchestra was a big problem. But yet is one of the longest standing traditions of making music as an ensemble. Because of that, it was more like a club of friends than an actual ensemble. So you can see them here taking a little break and relaxing. This was an advertising for one of the concerts, inviting people. Each of the performances will bring a revenue of an outstanding $149. And because of that, they realized that they needed to look for new ways in order to make a first-class ensemble, and with the quality that we recognize them having today. Yeah, that was a little fun picture I found. Evidently, they were having fun. There is 2 important events in this century that happens to that orchestra that actually will have relevance for us trying to understand the evolution of orchestras in the 19th century. The first one was 1877. The music director at that year was Theodore Thomas, or he became the music director. He conducted 14 seasons from then on, and actually created much more performances, all the way to 10 performances a year instead of the 3 to 5, depending on where we'll find it. Interestingly, Theodore Thomas actually had another orchestra in New York that was a competition to the New York Philharmonic, and then the only solution they found in the Philharmonic Society was to hire him, and therefore making the other orchestra disappear as an ensemble. They took both of them combined under the name New York Philharmonic, and then for 14 years was quite a successful relationship. That relationship ended in 1891 when he moved with 13 of the Philharmonic musicians and then founded the Chicago Symphony. So they tried to get him into the name, and then just decided to leave. That perhaps was telling that they knew that could happen. This is a picture of Mr. Thomas in his conducting attire. The other important event that I want to mention is 1890. Anton Seidel was named the music director of the orchestra. He was one of many, but one of the perhaps the most important name associated with Wagner. He was his conducting assistant, and yet after the passing of the master, he was one of the most renowned conductors of this composer's works. That meant that throughout the years that Seidel was the music director, the orchestra achieved already the world-renowned name that it has nowadays, and even was able to premiere the first of those first-class compositions commissioned by the orchestra, and specifically Anthony Borges' Ninth Symphony from the New World. 6 years later, he died suddenly from food poisoning. He was only 47 years old, and we only know what could have happened after if he was able to continue. Because one of the most important things that happens in the following century is that the orchestra feels the necessity, the need to call another great conductor, and that will be the name of Gustav Mahler himself. So that's the trade-off, I guess, of losing him from so early an age. Also, in conducting attire, I just wanted to give faces to these 2 important names. important icons of the transitions of the orchestra. Now, we know that New York Philharmonic was founded in 1842, but these are the orchestras that still today keep leading the charge into making symphonic music, but were founded in the 19th century. So when we talk about the big five orchestras, and next session will be a great moment to talk about that concept of what are the top five orchestras. In this case, we're going to concentrate exclusively in the, let's say, date of birth or the date of creation. The St. Louis Symphony was the second of the major orchestras created in the 19th century, and it was already in 1880. You start noticing what amount of time happened before the New York Philharmonic and the second one, and then everyone else had to wait that much. That's quite telling, and I hope that we keep it in mind in order to remember how important it is. Boston Symphony was created in 1881. Detroit Symphony was founded in 1887. Chicago Symphony, as we discussed earlier with our conductors, 1891, and the Pittsburgh Symphony, 1895. The other orchestras that still belong to that big name club are starting to be created in the 1900s and forward. So because of the scope of this session, we are not going to mention them today, but we're going to leave them for a following session. This is what I had planned for you. It is quite important to give the shape that the class take. We started today discussing the music of Anthony Philipp Heinrich and how he was the first of professional musicians and leading most of his professional life in Kentucky. But we also talk about how the second New England school at the end of the 1800s actually helped this germination of American music that later on the 20th century is going to flourish. The New York Philharmonic as the leading ensemble, but associated with all the groups that were created also around the same time from the 1800s on. And not only the New York Philharmonic was the one who commissioned the Antonin Dvorak to premiere his last symphony or to create his last symphony, but we will discuss next time how with the visit of Antonin Dvorak to the United States is that we truly starts giving a sense of what could be the identity in of symphonic output in America. We will say this is the end of our conversation today, just because of not only time, but also because it truly encompasses what happened mainly in the 19th century. And then our next session, we will have the opportunity to see how much or not Dvorak truly is an American composer or a symphony that is dedicated to America. So because those are two different ideas, and which composers actually take charge of trying to analyze, discover, and compose music that belongs, that has a sense of identity with the country. Very well. I hope everyone will have a wonderful week and then a good time listening to this. Do not forget, please remember, I am going to put the playlist so you can go and listen to more music. In the meantime, let's say goodbye with the beginning of that symphony that marks the modernity or the 20th century for the United States. all is left to say. This is our cliffhanger for next session. I hope you have a good time listening to all the pieces that we are putting forward for you. And I say goodbye. I hope to see you in our next session. Thank you very much.